Good evening. I'm Giulio Dalvit, the Assistant Curator of Sculpture at the Frick Collection in New York. Thank you for joining me tonight for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. So tonight I will present to you this relief of a resurrection by the Italian artist Lorenzo Di Pietro, known as Vecchietta. And this episode in a way is very close to my heart because Vecchietta was the subject of my PhD research. So I really hope I will be able to do some justice to this fabulous relief, which is, by the way, the only signed work by the artist outside of Italy. So Vecchietta was born in Siena in 1410, and he died there in 1480. He traveled a bit, but ultimately he spent most of his career in his hometown. And Siena is a small city in lower Tuscany. It used to be very rich, and until the mid-16th century, it was proudly independent from neighboring Florence, which is about 1 hour north by car today. And even for those of you who have never been to Siena, I bet you've seen the iconic images of this incredible shell-shaped square in the middle of the city, the Campo, as it's called, which is very famous also because that's where the different neighborhoods of the city, the so-called contrade, compete and meet twice a year in a very famous horse race, the Palio. Siena, however, is not really a place famous for its cocktails. So I was a bit at a loss tonight when I had to choose what to pair it with, to pair this episode with. But it is famous for its wines, including a very traditional sweet wine, Vin Santo, which translates as holy wine. And the origins of Vin Santo are somehow shrouded in mystery, but some say it was given this name because it was used during Mass. Others say that it's because during the plague of 1348, there was a friar who decided to give the sweet wine to the sick, and they actually were healed by it. And so it was called Vin Santo. Anyway, all over Tuscany today, Vin Santo is usually drunk in conjunction with cantucci, these small, very hard biscuits with bits of almonds in them, which are almost impossible to bite and chew because of how hard they are. But you can dip them in the wine, in the Vin Santo, and let them soak until they are softened, and they are absolutely delicious to drink and eat. So enjoy. So this is absolutely delicious. So the relief at the Frick is dated 1472, and that's a very important date for Vecchietta because that's when he finished casting this, probably his most important work, this bronze Chiborium, which you see on the right. Grossly speaking, a Chiborium is a freestanding tabernacle for the host. And this was made for the Church of the Hospital in Siena, but in 1506, it was moved to the high altar of the cathedral in Siena, where it has remained ever since for more than 500 years. The Chiborium is an outstanding work. It's made of more than 50 pieces, and it is more than 4 meters high and weighs around 600 kilos. And Vecchietta was paid an immense amount of money to cast it. So it is interesting to realize that at the same time, the artist could work in the same material on such a different scale in the Frick Resurrection. And since the Chiborium is all about the celebration of Christ's resurrection, I like to think in a way that a lot of the thinking that went into that monumental structure is somehow condensed in the small relief at the Frick, as we will see. But the 1470s were important for Vecchietta as a bronze sculptor, also because he cast this monumental statue of Christ for his own funerary chapel, where it would be backed, as you see on the right, by an altarpiece, also made by Vecchietta, because Vecchietta was both a sculptor and a painter and an architect, a goldsmith, and so many other things, a real polymath. Some time ago, I realized that Vecchietta's Christ was not a risen Christ, as all scholars had thought until since the 18th century, but especially because he's wearing the crown of thorns around his head, he must be a man of sorrows, a so-called man of sorrows, that he's Christ, that he's redeeming mankind through his suffering and his sacrifice, rather than his coming back to life as in the resurrection. And here I wanted to make this comparison with another very famous statue of a suffering figure in Siena, the St. John the Baptist by Donatello, which is now in the Cathedral of Siena, which Vecchietta knew obviously very, very well. And here, this comparison is really meant to show to you that Vecchietta and Donatello had two completely different attitudes to bronze casting. And more specifically also, they had two opposite ways of showing and conveying pain and suffering through the surface, the material of the bronze. The Baptist is a hermit, he's gaunt, and Donatello decided to match the figure's suffering with very rough surfaces of the bronze. Vecchietta, on the other hand, decided to do the exact opposite and create a stark contrast, in a way, between the pain that is oozing from the figure and the spotless finishing of the bronze surface. And to achieve that, you have to imagine that he had to work for months, if not years, with a lot of elbow grease, polishing the rough surfaces of the bronze. But as I told you before, Vecchietta was not just a great sculptor, he was also a great painter. And he was so great that here we have another of his firsts, in a way. In the late 1430s or early 1440s, he made this self-portrait of himself. And no other Italian painter had ever done anything quite as daring as this in terms of self-representation before. And thanks to this comparison here, you can also see that Vecchietta knew what thousands of miles away from Italy, young Van Eyck and artists like him were painting in the Netherlands. And with basically no gap chronologically. So despite operating on a local scale, Vecchietta was never, ever a provincial artist. So let's go back to the signature of the Frick relief, which I mentioned before. Vecchietta signed this, and this doesn't surprise us anymore, and I'll translate from the Latin, the work of Lorenzo di Pietro, the painter, also known as Vecchietta, from Siena, 1472. So he signs this as a painter. And that was, as I was saying, it doesn't surprise us now because we know that he was a painter, but we know that in many other cases, Vecchietta swapped his signatures in a way. So he signed his paintings as a sculptor and his sculptures as a painter. And why would you do that? That's the question that you may want to ask. And there are different theories. Likely it was a shrewd commercial kind of trick, like saying you are looking at a sculpture, but if you need a painting, I'm still your guy. But the most important point to make is that the all-encompassing word artist that we use today was not available to Vecchietta at the time. He would never call himself an artist. That's a much later category. At the time, being a painter, artists didn't exist as such. And being a painter was very different from being a sculptor. There were two different careers regulated by different guilds, and Vecchietta had to enroll in both guilds to work in different media. So by calling himself a painter on a sculpture, he was already making a huge step forward in challenging this system of guild regulations and going towards the idea of artist. And just imagine how different it must have been for him to think about the relationship between his own sculptures and paintings without this umbrella category of art as we have it today. But there was a lot of fluidity, obviously, between Vecchietta's paintings and his sculptures. And we can see here that Vecchietta had the design for this resurrection in mind for a very, very long time, at least since 1445, when he made this reliquary cupboard that you see here in the top right corner, where you see at the top a resurrection, which is very, very similar to the Frick one, made in a different medium 30 years earlier. And as I told you before, a lot of subtle thinking about the resurrection as an event went into the Frick relief. And what always captivates me, at least the most, about this work is the way in which you can't really make sense of it rationally. And that's mainly because Vecchietta combined two different perspectives here. We are on the same level as the Christ. We see the Christ on the same level as our eyes, but the soldiers are seen as if from below. And also the sepulchre occupies an awkward space in relation to the little mountains on the sides and the soldiers, one of whom is leaning against it. And also Christ is in such high relief that he seems to have sort of pulled out, left the background of the panel, and is coming towards the foreground of the scene. And yet the small angel head under his feet, if you look at it, still has its wings within the sepulchre. So here Vecchietta is telling us that whatever happened here during the resurrection, although we have the privilege of this vision, unlike any other human being, because we know that the soldiers were sleeping and nobody could actually see the resurrection, whatever happened here, though, cannot be represented according to the laws of perspective. It's a miracle, and as such, it happens in a space which is not rational, and it eschews the limits of human representability, as an art historian once said. And that's really something that many 15th century artists thought about. And in this altarpiece by Botticelli in the Courtauld Gallery in London, you see that the crucifix, the whole Trinity, actually, because this Christ, the dove of the Holy Spirit, and God the Father, sort of springs, appears from the end of the horizon at the center of the picture. But at the same time, the crucifix overlaps with, on the left, over the mountain behind Mary Magdalene, which is obviously impossible. It would occupy, which means it occupies a space which is not rationally representable. And on the right, Christ's fingers bend because they are touching the halo of the Baptist, which is a very poetic idea also. So this small relief is some kind of a tour de force, theologically speaking. And also the Christ, being almost in full round, has a meaning, because it alludes to the fact that Christ is resurrected with his actual flesh and blood. And so this is not just a representation, it's more of a coming into being of Christ. And if you look at the relief from the back, as you see here, you really get a sense of how the figure is about to leave the surface of the relief in a way. And here, the making and meaning of this work are so closely interconnected. It really is astonishing. But you may ask, what was the function of Vecchietta's resurrection? Nobody actually knows. Perhaps in 1472, there was some spare bronze, and they cast it for, like the Chiborium, for the hospital. And you see here the hospital in a picture. And by the way, this hospital actually still operated as a hospital well into the 1980s. But even if the function of this work is unclear, we know that it definitely belongs to a genre, a typology, which was frequent in Siena at the time. Works such as these, you see here 2 examples by Francesco di Giorgio Martini, a pupil of Vecchietta's. One is in Perugia, the other one is in Washington. These were called quadri di bronzo, bronze paintings, literally. So this was something that existed at the time. And whoever its original owner, there are seals on the back of the resurrection that tell us that it soon, in the 17th century, it passed into the property of Cardinal Flavio Chigi, this very important cardinal nephew of Pope Alexander VII, Chigi. The Chigi were a family of prominent Sienese bankers, so it makes perfect sense that they had a Vecchietta. And in 1692, the Vecchietta relief was recorded in this palace that you see in the top right corner. And this is a palace that any Italian person will recognize, because it's the seat of the Italian government today, but it used to be the Chigi Palace, and it's still called Palazzo Chigi. So the relief stayed within the family until the Chigi family, until the early 20th century, when it was bought by J.P. Morgan and was later sold to Henry Clay Frick, together with dozens of other bronzes from Morgan's collection in 1916. So now, after a century on 1 East 70th Street, you can come and admire the resurrection at Frick Madison in a room which is entirely dedicated to the extraordinary bronze collection of the Frick. And you can go there and see the relief on that wall and think in a way about, as we discussed today, the limits of representability, and also how lucky we are to have the word art in our vocabulary. So thank you for joining me tonight, and I'm looking forward to the next episode with you. Goodbye.